the pandemic would result in the death of cities. More recently, I think the commentary has been slightly less bullish and more nuanced, not just about the scale of the changes, but also their impact. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a real progress in the sense that we're getting to the point where we can understand a little bit better what's actually happening, and then we can think through more carefully what the implications of that is. So there's a lot for us to explore in the next hour or so, and we've got a great panel to explore those issues. So let me introduce them. We have Eleanor McGreeny, who's head of global research at Lightcast. We've got Timothy Bannister, who's director from Rightmove. We've got Katie Girdwood, who's senior business development manager at Local Data Company. And we've got my colleague, Valentine Quino, who's senior analyst at the Centre for Cities. So because we've got so much to cover, we're going to try and do this in two parts. So the first part is going to look at and get some sense from our panelists about the impact of COVID on the way that we live, work and shop in our cities. And then part two is going to explore the implications of those changes, great or small, permanent or temporary, on cities themselves and how they should respond. And I'm going to get the panel to offer some thoughts on part one very shortly. But before we get to the panelists, we're going to ask our audience, you, the audience, to answer a question. It's going to appear on the screen in a second. It's a straightforward yes or no, and you've got about 10 seconds to answer. So question one, we'll have another question a bit further on, is, has the pandemic permanently changed the way the majority of people live, work and shop in cities? So big question. We won't hold you to your preferences or your answers. Vote now. We'll give it a couple of seconds and then we'll get the answer up and then we'll pile into our panelists. So what's the answer? The answer is overwhelmingly 80%, just over, say that the pandemic has permanently changed the way the majority of people live, work and shop in cities. So that's very interesting, good bit of context. So yeah, let's hear from our panelists, and we'll do it in this order. We'll do work, then we'll do live, and then we'll do shop. So Eleanor, over to you. I think there's two kind of basic questions. It'd be good to get your insights as part of part one. One is, how has the way we work changed in the sense from workers' perspective and employers' perspective? And then, is there a geography to this? How would you think about that? So Eleanor, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. I think the labor market has changed a lot in the past 3 years, and there have been many changes, but definitely one that's got people talking about has been the rise of remote working and how this will completely change the way we work. So I'm going to focus on that change in particular. The first thing I'd like to say there is that actually I broaden it out, and it's not just about remote working. The pandemic has got employers and people talking more about ways of working more in general. And when we look at the job postings, for example, as a way to try and understand how this has changed over time, what we see is that before the pandemic, only 2% of job postings mentioned anything in relation to ways of working, be it remote working, hybrid working, but also not allowing remote working. And during the pandemic, this has really increased, and 12% of job postings mentioned anything about ways of working before declining and getting to stabilizing around 10% right now at the end of 2022. Now, a lot of this has to do with remote working, but some of it also has to do about what I was saying before about companies not allowing remote working. And this was something that we started seeing during the pandemic. So before the pandemic, employers weren't really specifying that remote working wasn't a thing for them. And during the pandemic, instead, we've seen 2% of employers clearly specifying that remote working wasn't allowed for them. This has decreased over time and is stabilizing around 1% now. But this was a first change that we've seen. Then on to remote working, what we've seen is that there has been a large increase in the number of job postings asking for or allowing for remote working or hybrid ways of working. And again, it's interesting to put the things in perspective in terms of numbers. Before the pandemic, we were talking about 1%, 1.5% of all job postings allowing remote working or hybrid forms of working. The number has increased to just shy of 10%. And it's interesting also the composition. Hybrid working, again, wasn't really a thing before the pandemic, and we are now seeing it in 1.5% of job postings. Remote working was very low, around 1 point something% before the pandemic, and is now around 8%. And we're seeing the numbers stabilizing on that. At the moment, we haven't seen a large decrease yet. Now, this is the broad context, but on to implications for cities. The first thing that we need to keep in mind is that not all jobs can be done remotely, and also that we're still talking about 10% of all jobs, even in a good day. So the majority of jobs in cities haven't really changed. They are the same as they were before. And when we actually look at the compositions of jobs that allowed remote working or other forms of working, they are highly concentrated nowadays on highly skilled professional jobs. So during the pandemic, we've seen a rise in remote working across different types of occupations, including low-skilled and middle-skills. These have remained very low at around 4%. So 4% of jobs in mid and low-skills occupations offer remote working nowadays. The share has gone up to 12% for professional jobs. So on to implications for cities. As we all know, cities all have different labor markets, different compositions of jobs. This really means that these ways of working and how it affected cities in reality affects a smaller subset of cities, which are the ones that have a high share of high-skilled professional jobs. And so that's the first point. And it's important also to think about what the implication can be in terms of cities. If we think that, or if we see that remote working can have an implication on agglomeration economies, then there are things that we need to think about in terms of how we can ensure that the productivity of these high-performing cities is not impacted by remote working. And then on the flip side, for the cities that actually don't have many jobs that are being done remotely, then the question and the implication is whether, and this is an open question, they can capitalize on this or not, and whether this will affect them longer term. I'll pass it back to you, Andrew.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks. That's really helpful. So, I mean, in a sense that, there's been quite a big change, but the base was so incredibly low that even though there's been quite a big change, as you say, we're still talking at, at the top end, around 12% of postings for higher skilled professional jobs now expressing something around the remote or the hybrid working. Is that right?
Yes. So at the upper end, we're seeing a high-skilled professional jobs mentioning remote working in 12% of cases. For the other occupations, it's super tiny. And when you think about the composition of the economy of different cities and how some are more skewed towards professional jobs and some other are more skewed towards the middle-skilled, lower-skilled jobs, you can clearly see that you start seeing a geography to this phenomenon that is not really something that is widespread across the country and that has different implications for different places.
And do you have any sense, so if that's from the employer's side, do you have any sense as to how employees, do you see searches for hybrid or remote stuff? Has that also gone up quite considerably or not?
So that's a good question. I can't see searches, so I can't really specify what people are searching for. But one thing that got me thinking ahead of this presentation today was one of the things that happened during the pandemic is that we've seen a rise in claimant counts, and then we've seen a decrease in that. And we are still seeing one of the tightest labor markets in history, not maybe in the whole of history, but like one of the tightest labor markets in the last few years. This means that unlike in other circumstances, employees have more powers compared to employers than they had in other times. Yeah. And so I think in this sense, their preferences might weigh in a different way compared to other times in history. If unemployment is high and you don't want to go to the office, but your employers wants you to go into the office, you don't have many choices. Is the tight labor market affecting things? I don't really know, but it's an interesting question to keep in mind. Yeah, no,
it's an interesting. Labor power is always the interesting question, and you've already begun to hint at answers to a couple of the questions that we've got in around, the different types of jobs that allude themselves to this space, but also then who holds the, who's in control, as it were. We'll come back to that when we get into the discussion. Tim, let's move to you and get a sort of a live perspective. Obviously, you at Rightmove, and we've been working with you trying to understand the patterns and how it's evolved and changed. So just give us a picture as to how the live elements have changed over the last 3 years, and then in part two we'll begin to draw out some of the implications for how cities should respond to those patterns. Tim.
Yeah, no, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so I suppose from a live perspective, what I'll talk about briefly is like I think there's been some changes to the what we want to live in, and there's been some changes certainly around where, and I think those changes are continuing. So, obviously from the beginning of the lockdown, I think our relationships with our homes changed. If you think back, it seems like a long time ago now, but if we could, we were working from home. Not everybody could, obviously, as we've just heard. But if we could, you could work from home, exercise from home, homeschool, and so on. And so sort of being cooped up in our own homes, I think when we came out of that lockdown, that initial lockdown, what we saw was that lots and lots of people wanted to change their homes because what they had, they felt at the time didn't quite fit with what they needed going forward. So we saw sort of, even as we were coming out of lockdown, we saw demand, which is when I talk about that's people contacting estate agents and letting agents and new home developers to find the next home. That sort of started to really ramp up even before lockdown was finished, that first lockdown. So we were seeing something quite unique, I suppose, that sudden urge to want to change where you lived and what you lived in. One of the things, in terms of if we think about what we found was that people definitely were wanting space, and one of the ways to show this was we looked at what's called keyword sort. So if you go onto Rightmove and you're trying to find your next home, you can actually put in a keyword that you want the property advert to contain. So if you were really into swimming pools, for example, you could put swimming pool, and then it would show you a list of properties that had that word somewhere in the description. So we've been charting that for many years, and what we found, like in the top 10, suddenly out of nowhere, the word acre came into the top, and it actually was number one. By September 2021, it was number one, and by June 2022, it was still number one. Garage is number two. Annex had become number three. Annex had come out of nowhere as well. So wanting that sort of your home to have that ability to have a bit of space, either for if you're lucky enough to have that to an office at home and so on. But rural and land had come in there as well in that September 2021. So that was a really key indication that things had changed. If we fast forward to now, acre has dropped down that list now. Acre's now number three. Garage and annex are 1 and 2 respectively. Garden is still up there on the sales side of things. So what people were looking for in their homes has changed. I think that tallies with the whole race for space or the rush for room and that kind of thing that we've talked about, that we'll talk about in a moment. On the rental side of things, it was a slightly different story. Garden came in terms of those words that people were looking for. But more recently, and pets were always very important, and pets was the most important thing. People were turning to that, and they wanted properties that enabled them to have a pet at home. But now it's more about the cost of living. So people are wanting properties which are cheap to run at the moment, and bills included has become a really important word that people look for in rental adverts. But I think there was a sort of a change around what people wanted, and that then was reflected in where people looked for that. So if we now talk a bit about the geography of it, firstly about those bigger moves. So were people making these life-changing moves, particularly as we heard we heard a lot in the press and so on, and we looked at it a lot ourselves around were people moving out of cities or people making life-changing moves to the coast and so on. And we did see an uptick in like the proportion of people making moves, sending inquiries from where they were to somewhere else that were above 50 kilometers. So we saw that it was around 14% back in January 2020. It kind of peaked in July, August 2021 at about 18%. So there was a change, so 14 to 18%, but it's now back down about 15% in terms of those big moves. Having said that, and that's in the sales segment, in the rental segment, it also has increased. Actually, hasn't come back down yet. It was hovering around the 10%, and it's gone up to closer to 15% in terms of people making those inquiries, which are sort of over 50 kilometers. What has changed perhaps more markedly was what people consider local. So their spread of inquiries for the people who are sending, the vast majority of people sending inquiries under 50K that has increased quite a lot and remains quite big. So the areas people are looking at, for example, have gone from your search area where you're sending your inquiries to, that's gone from 60 kilometers squared up to about 110 kilometers squared. So about 50 kilometer square increase in where people are looking for their next home. So, but it's still it's still under the 50K. So it's close, but it's like a bit broader area where people are looking. But it's quite a significant increase in that area. It's about the size of Manhattan that they're adding to their search areas. And I think that sort of leads us on to the that question around were people leaving cities. So I know we're focusing very specifically on cities today. So we do look at that quite a lot. And it's a bit of a different story between sales and rental at the moment. So if we look, well, one of the things we looked at is looking at all the people that live in or sending inquiries from who currently live in cities. So we looked at some of the top cities in the UK, and what we were looking at were what portion of their inquiries were leaving the city. So were they looking to leave the city? And what we found was, for consistently from 2020, 2021 to 2022, that proportion was increasing. So, or broadly speaking, but interestingly, it's come back. It's dropped down. So to put that into some numbers for you, broadly, so London, for example, back in 2020, February 2020, 61% of leads were from people in London were about staying in London. By mid 2021, that had gone down to 43%. So quite a significant change in that proportion. But when we look at February 2023, London, that's now back up to 57%. So it's gone 61, 43, 57 in terms of proportion staying in the city. And it's a similar story across many of the major cities, to a greater or lesser degree. So they haven't all moved in the same way, and some didn't move. Sheffield, for example, was 64, 55, 61. So Sheffield behaved a little bit differently to London. It's a bit more extreme in London, and in some other areas it happened a bit later. So Manchester, for example, took a bit longer for that dynamic to develop. But that's what we've seen. So we've seen the sort of out and then back in terms of the proportion.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I suppose I just mentioned on the rental side of things, perhaps because dynamics, as I mentioned, bills included, costs and so on, are a bit much of a concern there. We've seen that proportion of people looking to leave continue to increase. So it hasn't come back in the same way sales has. I think that's because we've seen obviously the dynamic, particularly 21, 22, of very, very fast-paced growth in rental prices. That's not abating at the moment, whereas it has significantly slowed in the sales sector. So people are still looking to move out from the rental side of things.
All right, that's fantastic. So we had a question from Jess Cunningham on the Q&A, which I'm just keeping an eye on. So I'll feed them in, Tim. So a slightly slimmer question, really, to what Eleanor we talked to Eleanor about, which is, when you look at the searches, I mean, on remote working, it's skewed towards highly professional, highly skilled, higher income type jobs and individuals. When you're looking in the sort of all the data you're looking at, where are we on the price band? Those that are looking to move. Is it at the at the higher end of the housing cost spectrum, or not, or is it all the way across the the price spectrum?
I think it was people that could afford to make those tended to be some of those bigger properties. So people looking for those bigger properties, and that's where we saw the biggest. It all then was reflected in price. Yeah. So to give you an idea, if you look from January basically pre-pandemic, Jan 2020, 2019, 2020, flats or smaller properties in London, price increase has been about 5% in that period. Large properties in Wales, it's north of 30% price increase. And that's a function of there aren't that many of those kind of properties there, for one, and so there's been a bit of an issue with stock. Yeah. But demand supply dynamics that's where people were looking to make those big moves, down to the southwest as well, and there just wasn't enough property, and that's why we've had this very, very different experience through the pandemic, depending on what where you're talking about and what property you're talking about.
Interesting, fascinating. Well, we'll come back to those, get you to kind of think about, the implications of all of that from a housing offer and in different places. Katie, let's come to you and fill in the sort of the last bit of the jigsaw, really, in terms of the shop perspective. Obviously, an awful lot was going on during has been going on during the 3 years. Shops closed, shopping habits change, etc. Just give us a sense as to what's been happening, and is there a geography to that as well?
Thanks, Andrew, and hi everyone. And it's interesting just hearing Tim's comment when I'm doing this from my small flat in London. So there we go. But yeah, I think on the shop side, I don't think there's any denying how kind of drastically the pandemic changed the way that we all kind of shopped and how we accessed certain goods. And I think retail and leisure being one of those kind of hardest hit in terms of restrictions. So if we think back just to that initial kind of division of essential and non-essential categories, and kind of those store closures kind of temporarily, that kind of then had huge implications on consumer shopping and what that meant for physical stores. And it's been really interesting to see kind of in the years since what that has kind of transpired to, and kind of as consumers have found their kind of new normal, if we're back to such a thing, if that exists. And I think kind of from LDC's side, I think one of the most significant impacts that we saw was kind of where people could and then also wanted to shop in a physical setting, kind of when those restrictions began to lift, at least. So we look at how this kind of played out in terms of vacancy rate. So vacancy rates are always a really good barometer for kind of the strength of the market and kind of market performance. And that allows us to then kind of quantify kind of the impact of COVID, but then how that kind of recovers in the few years since. So, I mean, no surprise, vacancy increased across high streets, shopping centres, retail parks. And it's interesting because the peaks in vacancy across all location types were actually seen in H1 2021, which was that kind of third lockdown, that longest lockdown. It feels like it went on for months on end. And vacancy actually reached 14.5% at that time, so the highest it's ever been. And then what's interesting, if we look at kind of recovery since then, is it's actually retail parks that have recovered much faster, kind of the speed of that recovery and that vacancy coming back down. So at the end of 2022, vacancy across retail parks has dropped to 9% from its peak of 11.5% in 2021. And I think when we look back at kind of how consumers were able to shop, it kind of points towards kind of shopping in retail parks, reasons being kind of there were much larger stores. It was much easier to abide by things like social distancing. They were outdoors, plenty of fresh air. And they also created opportunities for omni-channel shopping. So they had kind of click and collect hubs. They were easily accessible. They had kind of drive-through offerings as well. So kind of catered for consumers in that way. But kind of touching on how people shop as well, obviously there was a massive shift towards both online and localism. And I think that was just due to, there was literally no other way to access certain goods and certain categories. Some categories were not even accessible in a digital setting. So gyms, hairdressers, barbers, I know many people did try in lockdown to do self haircuts with varying levels of success. But, I think that obviously naturally meant that online sales increased dramatically because, that those non-essential categories, there was literally no other way to reach those goods. And what was interesting is that actually then continued even when stores reopened. And I think that's, there was a lot of that kind of COVID hesitancy, kind of a lack of confidence in kind of going back out to shops again. But I think as those kind of vaccines were rolled out, people were kind of wanting to get back to physical stores. Leisure, food and beverage, pubs and so on. So that's when we started to see that kind of market recover in that way. And then touching on kind of that localism aspect, again, people forced to shop locally. There was restrictions on kind of time out of the day, travel distance, all of those things. So people really kind of supported their local independent businesses throughout COVID. And I think those independent businesses as well were able to kind of adapt to changing restrictions much quicker. I know myself, I had many a coffee out of kind of an independent coffee shop window, and things like that. And they just played like that kind of vital role in communities in that time. And then how that then looked in terms of kind of the data we saw out of that was a much greater resilience in independent stores when we compared that with the multiples. So independent saw a net change of plus 2,000 units in 2021, compared with the multiples saw a net decline of 10,000. And independents are actually now still in growth at the end of 2022. So some really, really kind of staggering figures that we're still seeing now. There's still kind of mass kind of change and churn and activity across the market. And that LDC kind of, we look at the whole of GB. So it's then interesting when you can split that up into different regions, different kind of location types. So always been a huge disparity in performance by region. And I think what's really important to consider is kind of pre-pandemic, what certain regions or areas vacancy rate was kind of going into the pandemic, what that baseline was. So kind of a lot of the northeast, northwest, their vacancy rate was much higher. Of course, unsurprisingly, all vacancy across every single region increased. We were all in the kind of feeling the same kind of effects. But then it's how those regions and locations begin to recover. So kind of since then we've seen many regions kind of decline in vacancy as people return to physical stores. The northwest is actually the only region to see vacancy now fall below what it was kind of pre-pandemic, so 0.9% below its 2019 vacancy rate, which is incredible. But then in comparison, we've got regions like London, for example, that their vacancy increased and has kind of plateaued. It stayed where it was, and as Elena was saying, that could be due to less people returning to the office full time and so on. So yeah, lots to unpack in terms of how we shop.
That's really interesting. And your point about where places were going in, that affects how they how they were affected during, and obviously where they are afterwards, and that applies across labour markets and jobs, as well as the housing market, as well as the the retail market as well. It'd be interesting to get your collective thoughts on that, and also the degree to which at this point in time we can feel comfortable about some of the changes that you just talked about. We feel are permanent, as it were, or kind of there, or do we think there'll be much more flux, which we'll come to in a second. Valentine, you come on and you've been leading our work on how COVID is affecting cities and city centres across the country. So your reflections on that, but also what you've heard from Eleanor, Tim, and from Katie.
Thank you. Yes. Well, I guess the main takeaway from each of these contributions, and I think that's largely echoes the work we've been doing at Centre for Cities for 3 years, is that there has been change, but a lot of the huge change that maybe we predicted or some predicted when COVID hit hasn't really materialized. And that's true whether you think about it from a work, from a consumption, or from a housing perspective. I think there's a few reasons why we haven't seen a sort of radical transformation across these different areas. But I suppose one that's common to all of them is the fact that the fundamental benefits that cities offer as a place of production, consumption, places to live remain. So the reasons why in 2019 and long before that, most jobs, people, amenities were concentrated in cities, those reasons being the benefits of agglomeration, density, proximity to each other, still hold true today. So if you think about it from a production perspective, cities haven't lost their appeal to jobs and to businesses, particularly the most productive ones, because other types of locations still don't bring the same benefits. And the added value of those sort of face-to-face interactions explain why most of us have returned even a few days a week to the office. And on this, it's quite telling that the tools we've been using remotely, whether that's Teams, Slack, or Zoom, they all existed before COVID, and they've maybe improved on the margins since then, but we haven't really seen any sort of huge radical innovation in that space. And that's probably because despite our best efforts, it's just very difficult to replicate those face-to-face interactions. again, from a consumption perspective, that same density still enables those amenities to concentrate in cities. And that explains why we haven't seen a massive displacement of demand, from city centres to suburbs, and why most people have returned. When you look at footfall numbers, for instance, footfall has largely come back to its pre-COVID levels across a majority of cities. And so if you put together all those elements, those explain, well, cities still, pull people in as a place to live. And even if that means moving further away from the city centre, there's still this element of remaining within close distance to it that Tim talked about, because of the benefits that cities bring in terms of access to jobs and amenities. I think another important element here as well is that the changes that we have seen so far haven't radically sort of altered the economic geography of the UK. So, the pandemic hasn't really transformed our lives on the medium to long term. So there hasn't been a massive displacement on sort of the sources of economic growth from one part of the country to the other. So, when COVID hit, many people said that, remote working would mean that people would leave cities to go to other parts of the country, and that this would almost level up the country naturally. That hasn't happened, and the challenges remain the same. Now, that's not to minimize the impact that COVID has had on the way we live our lives, and it's certainly not back to square one. But what's been interesting, I think, is the changes we've seen have been mostly an acceleration of patterns that we already saw before COVID. So if you think of the struggles of the high streets, say in the fashion sector, for instance, or the move online, that's not new. That already existed before COVID. I think equally for people who have maybe moved away from the city, my understanding, and maybe Tim can confirm this, is that people who have moved away from cities would have moved out anyway, maybe later in life. So maybe they have done so a little earlier, and COVID has triggered that change, but we haven't seen a radical transformation in that space. I think the changes to the way we work are perhaps the most important ones, or at least the most radical ones. It will take probably more time to fully adapt to this hybrid model if it proves permanent, and even a 3 days a week pattern has implications for transport funding system, for the high street to some degree, for the type of office space that is now in demand and will not be built overnight. So I think that's where the challenges are, or at least some of the new challenges, alongside helping high streets thrive. I think we'll come back to this in the second part.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Valentin. We'll come on to the implications in a second. I just wonder, Tim, and then Eleanor and Kate, just, we've seen changes. Are they wholly different changes? Are they more of the same, as it were? Are they amplifying some of the patterns and trends? Remote working, as I understand it, hybrid working was slowly increasing, not massively, but it was increasing to a degree. COVID gave it a shot in the arm, terrible pun, but you know what I mean? Is that how you think about it, Tim? Is that how you think about the housing market now? Isn't some of the patterns are now, there's just more of what you saw before, or can you point to something are there bits where it is quite radically or significantly different?
I think I think the markets are always changing, and there's always sort of adaptations of things going on. And I suppose we're seeing it right now, actually, which is this point around the cost of living and how that's, on top of everything else that's happening now, that's coming in as another challenge, another thing people have to work out what's important to them and how do they optimize that. Alongside working out, are they going to be in the office 2 days a week, or is it 3 days a week, or is it 5 days a week? And I personally just don't think it has landed yet. If it would ever land, maybe it's just continuously sort of moving and changing as we progress. But we've certainly, I suppose that was some of the data that we saw, some knee-jerk reactions, big changes, which definitely were. It was real, the whole sort of dream of living by the coast and all that kind of stuff. For some people, that did happen. But then we sort of, we have seen things return in many ways to where we, broadly speaking, where we were before. But other things have changed, remain. I think the importance, that point around annex, which has been come in to be something that's important to people. They're just these are sort of little adaptations to what's important in the home, which perhaps wasn't there before and is a reflection of hybrid working and what's important to people now. So I suppose it's kind of, I'm not sure how that answers your question. Big changes, little changes, but adaptation as we go along. No,
quite. And it's difficult sometimes to get the kind of, there is no one big picture, as it were.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to have a big picture. But Eleanor, notwithstanding that, what's the big picture? I mean, in some respects, you look at the labour market in its entirety, right? You're not just only focused on segments of it. Is hybrid and remote working, and me talking about 10% of the overall job activity, is that it in a sense, or do you think there's a kind of broader cascading effect that we should be alert to as well when we think about labour market patterns and trends and what employers are looking for and what employees are looking for?
Well, there are a few different things that come to mind on your question. I think the main point that Valentin was saying earlier about the changes that the pandemic brought forward were things that were already somewhere in the labor market before is a really important point to start with, in the sense that we are seeing things that perhaps we all had Zoom and Teams before the pandemic. We were a bit hesitant about using it. The pandemic gave us that push and to start using it. And now that we all know how to use it, some of us decided to keep it. So in some parts of the labor market where that's possible, some of these changes are likely to stay. The effects broadly on the labor market will depend, and I think we're yet to see what's the full implications for the labor market. One thing that came to mind earlier while we're talking about this is also different parts of the labor markets or different sectors have taken different approaches to this. For example, the financial sector, especially in London, has taken a very strong stand against working from home. And we have seen that in the data. We've seen that working from home in that sector has gone down. We haven't seen any other industries or sectors strongly taking a stand either way. And so if they do, perhaps that will have an implications on the labor market. It goes back then to the point I was saying before, that we need to see where the market power may be at the moment. And if it's not now, maybe it's in a few years' time. And then the other thing is about the overall balance between work and life. And so, yes, hybrid working is one of the way that we can give people a more balance between work and life. But we've also seen increase in other ways of flexible working that are not about the ways of working, but about the other benefits that companies can offer. And so perhaps that is the way that ends up in the end, and is not about working from home. But we are yet to see. How this
that's a really interesting. I think that's a great. If nothing else, it's certainly given a real boost to the whole idea of flexibility in how you work, where you work. I think over and above specifics in relation to how that then translates into hours spent, or in one location than another. I think that's a very good point. Katie, come in on the thing again. Changes, step change or incremental, but also we've had a couple of questions around. Are we really talking about the offer of high streets being much more about high amenity? We hear a lot about the experience economy and all of that kind of stuff. That seems to be a pattern that we were getting towards anyway, right? In a sense, the pandemic came along and maybe give that a boost as well. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think as Valentin said, with the increase in vacancy and kind of store closures, that was an acceleration of kind of trends we were already seeing from kind of 2017, 2018. I think retail and leisure has faced kind of many challenges, CVAs, administrations. We then had the pandemic, and obviously now there's more challenges, kind of socioeconomic, cost of living. So there's always a challenge, I think, in terms of kind of what that looks like in terms of like shaping kind of that new kind of high street or new new shopping behaviors, or what those uses are. We get asked a lot LDC around kind of reoccupation and repurposing and redevelopment and what rate that's happening. Of course, there is kind of supply issues and building cost issues as well, but I think repurposing and identifying occupiers that are moving into some of this kind of vacant space that either has been newly vacant or kind of vacant long term, so kind of persistently vacant, and that kind of points towards a lot of the larger format stores or the ex-department stores, the likes of BHS and Debenhams and so on. It's like, what opportunities does then that create to kind of shape this new high street in city centres? You know, we've seen a lot of kind of flexible working spaces, a lot of those kind of community hubs. We've seen a lot of those kind of leisure kind of activity centres, food halls. You know, there's a lot of opportunity to repurpose those. I think it's interesting kind of from the LDC data as well to look at the time frame in which that happens as well. Kind of, I think it's about kind of 30% of the ex-BHS portfolio is still vacant kind of 7 years later, compared with sorry, that's wrong. So 70% of the BHS portfolio is now reoccupied 7 years later, compared with just over kind of 30% of the Arcadia portfolio 2 years later. So it's getting a sense of what that time frame looks like, but being able to identify kind of what works and what doesn't in that reoccupation element. That's
really good. So we've already done it, but let's move on to this. You know, I suppose get your thoughts on what does this mean for cities, and more particularly, you know, those that are responsible for or running, you know, those cities in various ways. And I'll come to Valentine in just a second. But can we chuck up the second question for the audience on this particular? So same gig. Do you think these changes that we've been talking about will be broadly positive or negative for cities as places to live and work? So you have to think about trade-offs, right? So you get into a net position. There'll be some goods and some bads. When you net all that out, which I'm sure everybody is doing on a daily basis, do you think that the change is broadly positive for cities or broadly negative? Again, big question. You can interpret that in lots of different ways. What's the answer? Let's see. We have a nuanced, suitably nuanced audience that understand, you know, the value of trade-offs, but nevertheless, 2 to 1 or 65 to 35 saying that they're going to be broadly positive, which is good, I think, if that is true. Valentine, are you broadly positive or are you broadly negative? But more particularly, how are cities responding? You know, where's the thinking? We talk to cities up and down the country all the time. They're thinking about these kind of issues. Just give us a flavour for that.
Yeah, I think I'm broadly positive, and I think cities have been through much worse. But in terms of your question, I guess the answer is just to adapt. But part of, you know, I guess the answer is also, you know, depends on whether or not we think we've reached a new equilibrium. So I don't really have the answer to this yet. I think there's probably still a few moving parts. But if and when we reach this new equilibrium, the answer will be to adapt. So on the work front, for instance, there's not much policy can do to force people back in, but there's a lot to do in terms of assessing the impact of the 3 or 4 days working week on local services, on demand for office space, or on public transport finances, to give a few examples. On the high street, again, you know, there's a lot of work to be done to help places transition and adapt to the changing nature of demand, and making easier to convert, for instance, empty retail units into other types of uses. But again, I think the answer to these questions will also not be the same depending on where we look at in the country. So in central London, the biggest question will be, you know, the future of the CBD, the future of this very specialized office space sort of area, and perhaps diversifying away from the office space. In cities like Sunderland, it will not be the same questions. It will be around moving away maybe from over-reliance on fashion or other types of retail. So I think, you know, again, the answer depends on where you're looking at. I guess there's another thing to say here is that in terms of what cities need to move forward, it's equally important to move away from this recovery from the COVID framework. So there's 2 reasons for this. The first is that in many parts of the country, particularly those that, you know, underperform economically, moving back to where they were in 2019, which is, you know, it's just not good enough. And the other reason why that's the case is that I think there's a bit of a risk that if we use too much a sort of recovery from COVID framework, then that deters policy from making the right type of investment and thinking, you know, long term. So, you know, for instance, because we moved closer towards a hybrid work model, that doesn't mean that the cities that have a chronic shortage of office space don't need it anymore. The same is true for transport. You know, for instance, when Crossrail opened, for instance, that many people sort of questioned the rationale for expanding the public transport network, given the new hybrid working pattern. And I think that's not quite the right way of thinking about these issues, even in a world where people commute fewer days a week. You know, I think recovery shouldn't be just thinking short term, should be thinking long term as well.
Brilliant. Excellent. Good sound advice to think about, the fundamentals, but also not to be drawn into what you would wish to happen as much as what is actually happening. Eleanor, give us a sort of labour market view for cities based on the patterns that you're seeing. How should they be thinking about and responding to to some of the patterns, not only in a narrow sense but broadly, about how they can help their labour markets adapt and change.
Yes, so I'd say on that and on the question overall, I'm also in the team broadly positive. So I think the changes can bring something positive to cities in general, and cities have proven that they are a place where people need to be and that they value. So there is that as a starting point. In terms of labor market, I think again it depends on where you are in the country and how the pandemic has affected you. Because if I think at cities that are strong, or there were and they still are strongly performing, and they are the cities where there is a high share of remote working, so where the change of remote working is actually impacting the most in terms of business activity, I think the question there, and it's something that we don't have an answer yet, is trying to understand what's the impact that remote working has on productivity, on firms' productivity. Is this affecting agglomeration? We know that businesses all stay in one place because there is a benefit for them to be close to one another. And we know that within a business, having all people working in the same office can be good for productivity and sparkling ideas. Is remote working changing this? Is affecting it negatively? And if so, what can companies do? And understanding it at the city level can help these places understand a longer term what the impact of the pandemic can be in terms of ways of working. And then there is a wider point that starts with labor market and with working from home and goes into another area of what cities are for, if you want to put it that way, and is cities as a place to live. And this is an important thing that goes beyond working from home. If we are assuming that people that work from home increase the value they put on a place as a place to live, then places that want to be successful need to improve their offer in terms of places to live, not just in terms of places to work. And this again means different things in different parts of the country, because some places would start from a better point of view than others. And the parts of the countries that traditionally struggled before the pandemics not just in terms of their labor market offer, but in terms of their city center offer, in terms of their wider offer and amenities offers. And so this won't facilitate their the fact that people won't move there if they won't find the amenities they need, and they'd rather move somewhere else. And also for the places that are struggling economically, even if you manage to attract people that work from home, which is a good way to bring income inside your labor market, then there is also danger, and I think to keep in mind, is that you are incredibly dependable on the success of the businesses in other parts of the country to maintain this system, which is a very risky position to put yourself in.
That's very good, and lots in there, good things for us to think about. Tim, I mean, pick up this point. I mean, what's noticeable, Valentine and both Ella touched on it, certainly talking to places during and as a result of COVID, much greater emphasis and more thinking on the non-work aspects of their places, the livability, the amenity offer, which talks to, where Katie comes in this as well. But just pick up on that, the livability, question, which is not just about the internal space, but how the internal space interacts with the external space. What do you think the implications for cities are in that sense?
Well, I think it's so important. I'm broadly positive. I think cities have been around for, London's almost 2,000 years old, isn't it? And I'm a Londoner. I love London. I think they adapt over those periods, always adapting, always changing, always finding a way to sort of solve the problems of the day and what's coming down the track. And I think, when you go, we work in the office. We go in and then you see the buzz and what people are finding important about being in the city. Perhaps it's a little bit different to what it was before. Now that social interaction becomes so important. Thursday night out is now massive. It was always a good night, but now it's a massive night. It's the opportunity that everybody comes in and spends time with each other. But I think, when you're designing, we're already seeing it. There are a couple of things that when you're designing accommodation, you're considering what it is that's important to people when you're putting it into the actual design. but then also how you talk about that to people, how you make people aware of what you've got in your area, in your building, if it's build to rent or if it's a build to sale. What's the lifestyle that you're offering there? And I suppose what we're seeing now is that that point around people are moving within cities more. Like the local has changed, so you can find, you're trying to optimize your living situation, but you might find that you're bringing people to where your area is from an area that wouldn't have looked at your area before because they didn't know about it, but now they're finding out about it. It's got all the things that they want. So I suppose it's about raising that level of communication about what is available in different areas, because people are now much more open about moving, I think, than they were, to find the things that they want. So I think that's really important for people to consider how they talk about what's available in their area that matches what people are now, the changed priorities of people, and their willingness to look further afield to find what they want, albeit still within the confines or pretty close to maybe where they were looking before.
Yeah,
I think that's key. So like that slight change in mindset about how you talk about your area and where people are going to be moving from to within what local means, I suppose, is the change. And
do you think, just in that sort of space, Tim, just your kind of brief thought on, thinking about the housing market, particularly from the distinctions between a rental and a sales perspective. Is there something serious and significant we should really think about in that when we think about the housing market and the offer in terms of rental versus sales? I guess there is, right? But
yeah, I think there's a huge amount of innovation at the moment in the rental sector about what the build to rent sector that's come from a very small base and is growing very quickly, and they're talking about accommodation as a service, and really improving the lives of their residents and giving the residents exactly what they want and building these brands. And I think some really interesting stuff happening in that space, really understanding what those residents want and then building that into the fabric of the building, but also then into the service wrapped around it. So the local area, the amenities, the safety, the security, of tenure, but also of where the area itself. So I think that would be an interesting area to look at, and how that then sort of I suppose it's going to need to be pulled into the sales segment as well, because it's growing quickly and it's quite attractive. So I would imagine there'll be a response on that service side in the sales offering as well, because particularly for that first time buyers age group, perhaps they're staying in rental accommodation for longer. Maybe not, sometimes not by choice, but maybe increasingly by choice, because the quality of that offering is improving so quickly. Yeah, no, that's very good, very good. Kate, you come in on this point, the sense that there's a real kind of growth on livability questions, but also amenity offer, and then that that has obviously direct implications for the nature of the city centre or the high street or the town centre being more than just some shops, and how then we repurpose either existing or previous shop fronts, etc.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting point, and kind of a lot of the work that LDC do, kind of we work with councils, we work with commercial landlords, and recent work has been much more about identifying kind of what that actual kind of retail mix or leisure mix looks like in city centres or kind of surrounding areas, and what that looks like by category, being able to identify kind of where that undersupply where that falls and where potentially there's an over surplus. And as I mentioned before, we do a lot of work around kind of tenant strategy and identifying these kind of new and exciting kind of acquisitive occupiers that are taking up space. We're seeing a lot of international brands coming through, and they're kind of very at the heart of city centres. Also digitally native brands that are taking up space. So as much as it's been a really, really kind of few kind of challenging years for retail and kind of consumer spending and shopping, there's still challenges going ahead, but there's absolutely still kind of positive kind of areas of growth and, you know, categories we're seeing and brands we're seeing that are flourishing, and almost using kind of this new vacant space as an opportunity to open in either places that weren't previously available or affordable. So it'll be, yeah, interesting to see kind of what this new normal looks like. And just need to mention, because it is out today, but LDC's annual report has been published, and all of these kind of metrics are available for kind of over the past 10 years and kind of what that looks like up to the end of 2022 as well, if anyone wants any more detail.
Yes, I strongly recommend it. It's always a good read. So
thank you,
those on the call, go and have a search for it, dig out all the data and have a look at what it means for different places. I mean, we're getting towards the end. I mean, Eleanor, just a quick thought from you. Do we have any sense as to whether the sort of search geography or the geography over which now people are looking for work has changed? I mean, one assumption would be if you're only going into the office stroke 2 or 3 days a week, you know, that frees you up to be slightly more, you know, to be further away almost from, you know, from your place of work, even if you're going into the city centre, whatever that might be. If you're only doing 2 or 3 days, an hour and a half's commute might be more acceptable than maybe if you're doing it 5 days. Do we have any sense as to how the labour markets are changing? Because that touches a little bit on what Tim was saying around, you know, searches going out, but not going, you know, ridiculously out, but they're still in that kind of, you know, 50, 60K kind of bracket, but they may go further as people settle in. Do you have any kind of sense of as to how that's changed?
I don't have a strong sense of that in terms of specific numbers that I can put on different radius. I suspect that what you're saying is probably what you see in the labor market in terms of changing. Distances mean different things nowadays in the labor market. And I actually think if you flip it around to employers and put in remote job postings online, that's the employer's way of increasing the radius in which they're catching talent. So you all of a sudden are not just looking at the labor market of a specific city, but you are also broadening it out to other parts of the country as well. So I suspect it's definitely something that I know from the data that we're seeing from an employer's point of view. And I suspect you'll see similar things from the other side as well.
Yeah, no, and it'll be interesting. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And I think, you know, it'll be interesting, Tim, to see whether places think about, you know, supply side responses, right? How they provide housing then at a reasonable price point, that so they become attractive to, you know, potential workers, you know, whatever their working patterns are. And I think that will be an interesting area, because we don't see much of that at the minute, at least. Supply has obviously takes a while to come through, but we haven't really seen significant changes on the supply side. Prices definitely have changed, but new supply has not. Okay, it's 1 o'clock. We're now on, so we could go on forever on this, which would be fantastic, but we can't because you're all busy people and we need to leave. So a big thanks to my panel, Eleanor, Tim, Katie, and Valentine. Thank you all for coming and posting your questions. I think we picked up quite a lot of the themes in the questions, so that's always good. If you want to watch the event again, in case you missed anything, recording will be on our website pretty soon. And Katie's done her plug, so let me put a plug in for next Thursday, the 23rd. We'll have a briefing, which you can get online, ironically, which will be about how online and offline shopping patterns have changed and been affected during the pandemic, and again, what that means for cities and the future of city centres in particular. So keep an eye out for that on the 23rd, next Thursday. But until the next time, take care and stay safe. Thank you very much for being with us. Bye for now.